All right, buckle up for a deep dive
Ooh, this is going to be a good one.
into a story that might make you think twice about those tires on your car.
Yeah, this one's,
We're talking about Firestone, the
Firestone.
rubber giant,
Mm-hmm.
and their operations in Liberia
Oh, Liberia.
during their brutal civil war in the 1990s.
Yeah, the 90s were a rough time there.
This is one of those stories that raises all sorts of questions about corporate responsibility,
Oh,
the
yeah.
true cost of doing business in conflict zones,
Huge.
and whether a company can really stay neutral when everything around them is falling apart.
Right, you can try to stay out of it, but...
So for this deep dive, we're looking at an article called Liberia's Civil War, the deadly link between warlords and Firestone's rubber empire.
Catchy title.
And let me tell you, it gets pretty intense.
I bet.
So picture this. Firestone, known for tires,
Right, tires.
smack dab in the middle of a war zone.
Oh.
What were they thinking?
Yeah, that's the big question, isn't it?
Was Firestone complicit in the violence?
Well, that's what we're going to try to figure out today.
So let's start with some context.
Okay.
Firestone had a long history in Liberia.
Oh, yeah, way before the war.
So paint us a picture. How big was their operation? What was their relationship with the country like?
Their roots go deep, all the way back to the 1920s.
Wow.
By the late 80s, they had built the world's largest rubber plantation in Liberia,
Really?
over 220 square miles.
220 square miles.
To put that into perspective, that's bigger than some entire cities.
Geez, that's huge.
Yeah, it was a massive operation.
So they were a major employer then,
Definitely.
and a huge contributor to the Liberian economy.
Couldn't avoid them.
So practically woven into the fabric of Liberia.
Yeah, you could say that.
And then the Civil War breaks out in December 1989,
Right.
led by Charles Taylor.
Charles Taylor.
The article paints a pretty vivid picture of him.
Oh, he's a fascinating character.
Tell us about him.
Well, he was a former government official who launched this insurgency against President Samuel Doe. He had backing from leaders like Muammar Gaddafi,
Oh, wow.
and his rebel forces, well, they had a reputation.
What kind of reputation?
Well, being swift and brutal.
Brutal.
The article even mentions his fighters wearing talismans into battle.
Talismans.
Yeah, like charms.
What for?
They believed it made them invincible.
Wow. I bet that was terrifying for the people facing them.
Absolutely. Imagine the fear that must have instilled.
That's a chilling detail.
It is.
So how did Firestone, this American company with this massive operation, react to a war closing in on them?
Well, initially,
Yeah.
it seems they were a little naive.
They
They believed their economic importance would shield them from the conflict.
So they thought they were too big to fail.
Sort of. They figured both sides would recognize Firestone as too valuable to disrupt
Interesting.
and leave them alone.
That seems like a big gamble to take,
It was.
with a civil war raging around you, especially with all their employees to consider.
Right. A lot of people depended on them.
So as the fighting intensified,
Right.
it became clear that this wasn't just some minor political squabble.
Oh.
Firestone's plantation, strategically located,
Unfortunately for them.
found itself right in the middle of the conflict.
Caught in the crossfire.
So they were trapped, whether they wanted to be or not.
Pretty much.
What did they do? Did they pull out, try to stay neutral, or...
Well, pulling out of an operation that size,
Yeah,
logistically, it would have been a nightmare.
I can imagine.
Plus, just leaving,
Yeah.
it could have been seen as taking sides.
Oh, I see.
So they tried to navigate this very dangerous situation.
That must have led to some tough choices.
Oh, absolutely.
The article mentions some accusations against Firestone, that they ended up aligning themselves with certain factions in the conflict,
Yeah.
including Taylor's forces,
Right.
to protect their business.
Yeah, it's a complicated situation.
So did they directly support Taylor's forces?
Well, there's documented instances of Firestone paying taxes to Taylor's forces.
Taxes?
Yeah, to operate in their territory.
So how does Firestone explain that?
Well, Firestone maintains they never directly supported any side of the conflict. They say they only made these payments to ensure the safety of their workers.
So they were just trying to survive.
That's their claim.
But for people looking in from the outside, it would be easy to see those payments as supporting a rebel group.
It's understandable.
What do you think? How did this situation impact Firestone's public image?
Well, it definitely tarnished their reputation.
I can see how.
The accusations of complicity in the war, of putting profit over the safety and well-being of the Liberian people, those were hard to shake off.
So their initial belief that they could just stay neutral and continue business as usual, that backfired.
Oh, yeah, to put it mildly.
They found themselves having to make decisions with some very serious ethical implications.
Absolutely.
Decisions that people are still debating today.
They are.
And we haven't even talked about the impact on Liberia itself or the long-term consequences of those decisions.
Right, we've only scratched the surface here.
This is just the beginning of our deep dive.
We need to understand the whole story.
The motives and actions of all the players.
To really grasp the gravity of what happened in Liberia.
This is heavy stuff.
It is.
We've been talking about these accusations against Firestone. Specifically, those payments to Charles Taylor's forces.
Right.
The company insists they were just trying to protect their workers.
Yeah.
And their operations.
I can see that.
But it raises the question, was there another way?
It's a question worth considering.
Could Firestone have navigated this situation differently?
Maybe.
Could they have taken a more proactive approach?
Yeah.
To safeguarding their employees?
Possibly.
Without getting entangled in the conflict?
That is the tough part.
I mean, pulling out entirely would have been a huge decision. With its own set of consequences, right?
Absolutely.
They were the largest private employer in Liberia.
Right.
Imagine the economic fallout.
Oh, yeah.
If they had suddenly shut down their operation.
It would have been devastating. It could have destabilized the entire region.
So they were stuck between a rock and a hard place.
I think so.
But even if we try to understand their reasoning, I keep coming back to the human cost.
I understand.
The article talks about horrific atrocities committed during the war.
It was a brutal conflict.
How could Firestone, knowing what was happening, justify continuing to operate?
That's a moral dilemma, no doubt about it.
It highlights the challenges of conducting business in a conflict zone.
It does.
Some would argue that by remaining in Liberia, Firestone was implicitly condoning the violence.
That's one way to look at it.
Even if they weren't directly supporting any particular faction.
It's a gray area.
The article uses the term symbiotic relationship
to
describe the connection between Firestone and the Liberian government. What does that really mean in this context?
Well, it was a relationship born out of necessity. But it definitely wasn't equal.
In what way?
Well, the Liberian government was heavily dependent on Firestone's taxes.
I see.
And revenue.
Makes sense.
They needed Firestone to keep operating.
To keep the money flowing.
Exactly. Especially as the war drained their resources.
So the government needed Firestone.
Oh, yeah.
But did Firestone need the government?
That's a good question.
Especially a government that was clearly struggling to maintain order and control.
Well, on the surface, it seems like Firestone would have been better off without a weak and unstable government.
Right.
But they had this massive investment in Liberia, this complex operation that required at least a basic level of infrastructure.
And stability.
Right.
So they needed the government to function, at least on some level.
Exactly. Even a flawed government was better than no government at all.
At least from Firestone's perspective.
It allowed them to maintain the illusion of business as usual.
Even as chaos unfolded around them.
It's a strange juxtaposition.
And what of the Liberian people?
Yeah.
The ones actually living through this war.
I mean,
what was their perspective on Firestone?
It's complicated.
How so?
Well, on one hand, Firestone provided jobs, which were desperately needed with the economy in shambles.
So that's a good thing.
It was. Those jobs often came with difficult conditions.
What do you mean?
Long hours, low wages. So they were providing a vital service, but potentially also benefiting from the instability and desperation caused by the war.
Yeah, I see what you mean.
It's hard to say for sure if they were exploiting the situation.
Right.
Some would argue they were taking advantage of a vulnerable population.
A workforce with limited options.
It's a tough question to answer definitively.
Definitely.
But it's a question that needs to be asked.
For sure.
The article makes it clear that the human cost of this war was staggering.
Yeah, it's hard to even comprehend.
Hundreds of thousands of people died.
It's heartbreaking.
And the country was left deeply scarred.
Can we draw a direct line between Firestone's actions and that suffering?
It's impossible to say for sure.
Right.
But what we can say is that Firestone was undeniably a part of the fabric of Liberia during this conflict.
Their presence had an impact.
Their decisions had a ripple effect throughout the country.
To ignore that would be a mistake.
I agree.
It seems like there's a tendency, even today, to view corporations as separate from these larger conflicts.
As if they're just neutral actors.
Caught in the crossfire.
But this story challenges that notion, doesn't it?
It does.
Firestone's story in Liberia is a powerful illustration of how deeply entangled corporations can become in conflict zones.
And how their choices have consequences.
Not just for their bottom line.
But for the people and communities around them.
Absolutely.
So what lessons can we learn from Firestone's experience in Liberia?
That's the million-dollar question.
How can companies, especially those operating in politically unstable regions, avoid making similar mistakes?
I don't think there are any easy answers.
Right.
This story compels us to examine the role of corporations in conflict zones.
To ask tougher questions.
About the true cost of doing business.
And to demand a higher level of accountability.
Exactly.
It's about recognizing that corporations, just like individuals, have a responsibility to act ethically.
Even when it's difficult.
Even when it impacts their profits.
It's about doing the right thing.
And that responsibility extends to their workers.
Of course.
To the communities they operate in.
Right.
And ultimately to the world as a whole.
I think so.
So what's the takeaway for our listeners?
What should they be thinking about as they consider this complex story? I think the key is to see this not just as a historical case study, but as a lens through which we can examine the choices companies are making right now.
All over the world.
Exactly.
You know, it's easy to feel kind of overwhelmed by a story like this.
Yeah, I get that.
We've been talking about war and exploitation and corporate greed.
Heavy stuff.
It can feel like these huge issues, you know?
Right.
Like they're totally beyond our control.
Absolutely.
So what can we as individuals actually do about any of this?
Well,
does our consumer choice even matter?
Those are valid questions for sure.
Like, where do we even start?
Well, I think that feeling of being overwhelmed can actually be a starting point.
Really?
Yeah, think about it.
Okay.
If we feel overwhelmed, imagine how the people of Liberia must have felt during that war.
I mean, yeah, I can't even imagine.
Caught between these powerful forces, their lives completely upended by violence and instability.
Right.
It really highlights the importance of agency.
Agency.
Having a voice, feeling empowered to make a difference.
Okay, so where do we start?
I think awareness is key.
Awareness?
Knowing where our products come from, understanding the impact of our choices as consumers.
Right.
Those are powerful first steps.
Yeah.
And it's not just about shopping habits either.
No.
It's about being engaged citizens.
So, like being informed.
Yeah, asking tough questions of our elected officials.
Holding companies accountable.
Exactly.
Supporting organizations working to address these issues.
All of that.
So, knowledge is power.
But it's what we do with that knowledge that truly matters.
I like that.
Firestone's story in Liberia, as troubling as it is, it can serve as a catalyst for action.
A catalyst.
It reminds us that the world is interconnected.
Right.
That our choices here can have ripple effects.
Far beyond our own borders.
It's true.
We have a responsibility then.
To use our voices.
To demand better from the companies we support.
And to advocate for a more just and equitable world.
You know, it's so easy to get caught up in the day-to-day.
Oh, yeah.
Just focus on our own lives and our own problems.
It's human nature.
But stories like this,
Yeah.
they remind us that we're all part of a larger system.
We are.
And that our action
Even seemingly small ones.
can have a real impact.
Every choice matters.
It can feel overwhelming.
Sure.
But it's also empowering.
To realize we're not powerless.
We can make choices that align with our values.
Absolutely.
And we can use our voices
Yeah.
to push for change.
That's the key.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave our listeners with this thought.
Yeah.
Knowing what we know now about Firestone's history in Liberia, how does this change our perspective on the products we consume
The companies we support.
and the impact of our choices in a globalized world?
It's a question worth pondering.
It is.
It really is.
Well, that's about all the time we have for today's deep dive.
Wow, that went by fast.
Thanks for joining us.
It's been a pleasure.
And we'll see you next time for another deep dive into a fascinating topic.
Can't wait.